as students, you are pushed from high school to then immediately jump into university, where you then have no time to fulfill yourself, to experience things and go to different places, meet new people, and expose yourself to cultures. I think that is particularly harmful. I think that as students, we do support the rise of gap years, of breaks where students are able to develop themselves. Three things then in my speech. Firstly, 2 points of setup on why people take gap years, and secondly, on what gap years look like. Then 2 points of substantives. Firstly, on why it's better financially for students and why they're able to better afford university. And then secondly, on why students are better developed personally and are able to gain new experiences. Firstly, then on setup, why do people take gap years? I would generally categorize this into two themes. Firstly, I think probably take gap years in order to do things like personal enjoyment or develop themselves. Like, for example, spending time on things like hobbies that they weren't able to pursue in high school, or like going places and like traveling to different places, exposing themselves to new cultures and new types of people. I think that is something that is personally enjoyable and personally relevant to students. Secondly, I think that related to this theme, I think that like if students don't know what to do with their lives, they probably also are able to just take time to like think about themselves and to think about what they like actually want to do. Secondly, then I think that students also are very likely to take gap years in order to do things like work, in order to do things like gain money to necessarily afford university or to pay off their student loans or for any other circumstance. I think that it is extremely real for students to actually have to take gap years and to take time to work and to actually like gain finances, right? Secondly, then what do gap years necessarily look like? I think that I kind of gone through this in my previous point of setup, but I think it looks like things like extremely valuable personal experiences, like going out to travel, like volunteering, like working, etc., etc. Okay, then on to substantive. Two things. Firstly, I think that students will be better off financially. Generally, three mechanisms for this. Firstly, I would note that as stated in setup, oftentimes people just do take gap years in order to work, or at the very least, even if that were not true, I think that having a gap year or like having gap years being more normalized just provides students with the opportunity to work who otherwise might not have, or who otherwise might have been pushed into university into a much worse situation. So what does that necessarily look like? I think that vulnerable or struggling students who are not able to actually afford university, or who like have to prioritize finances for whatever reason, are just presented with the opportunity or the time to actually work and the time to actually like better themselves financially. I think that is a far better option than for example, like working during the semester, in a period of time where you're probably already quite busy with all of your studies and you probably already want to do quite well in your studies. I would also note that like in some schools, you're not even allowed to take part-time jobs during the semester. I think that's a very, very bad situation for these students to be in. It's far better for gap years to be more normalized and for more people to take gap years in which they're actually given that opportunity and the time to work. Secondly, I think that like regardless of your financial situation, I think that if you go on a gap year to actually get a job and to actually work, I think that you just are given a better idea of the market in that you've been exposed to the actual market. You've had a job, you've been employed, you've been working for a year, like you just know what it's like. You know about things like employability, about like what fields are like to get better jobs. I would note that this is probably far better information and far better knowledge than simply doing research on Google or whatever counterfactual there would be, because you're actually experiencing it, you're actually there. Third mechanism, then, I think that you're just simply more qualified in that you've just spent a year working. Like, that's just going to be on your resume. That's an extra year. I think that you're more qualified, especially in the time like right now where it's extremely difficult to get jobs because entry-level positions require lots of qualifications, things like that. I would note then, why is this work experience particularly going to be quite valuable? Why is it not going to be like a random part-time job? Then firstly, then I would note that in the situation in which students choose to defer uni and put it off for a year in order to work, that's probably because they have a very good reason to do so, simply because uni is still considered to be the more desirable option to go to. That is, they have something better lined up, they have a job lined up, or like they actually desperately need that money. And secondly, even if it was like a quote like lesser valuable job, I still think that that is quite valuable experience. You are able to derive a lot from that. Before I move on, I'll take a POI. Three,
But that
two.
these lower class jobs doesn't actually bring the financial benefits that you propose. So please engage.
So I would note that in the instance in which a student who is struggling and who actually requires money, like goes and takes that job, that's probably because they have no other better option. Like even if you're getting paid like $10 an hour at McDonald's or whatever, that's probably the best thing that you can get. That's better than the counterfactual, which is being forced to go to uni and then forced to also then work that $10 an hour job and like be incredibly busy. I still think that this is better than the counterfactual. Okay, then what are the impacts of this? Firstly, I think it's huge for students who cannot afford uni, because it's like the difference between being able to go or not. It's a difference between like us supporting their family or not. I think that is just hugely beneficial. But secondly, for the like everyone else, right, I think that even if all other students just get slightly better jobs or just pick their degrees slightly better, I think that's a huge benefit if you weigh it on scale, because I would know it is a large like amount of uni students doing this. Second point then, what about students who take gap years for other reasons? So like personal development, volunteering, traveling, et cetera, et cetera. Second point then on why students are now better personally developed and why they gain more experiences that are quite valuable. Three max. Firstly, I think that in gap years, you also do things like travel. You do things like pursue hobbies you would not have otherwise had time to do so. You see the world, you meet people, you get exposed to cultures you had never heard of. I think that you're only necessarily really able to do these things when you are like younger, when you like want to see the world, when you're not like chained down by your job and your kids and your family and whatever. I think that these experiences are like unique to you as a student out of high school and going into university. Secondly, then, like I think that like when you're given a large amount of time, like a large amount of time as a break, I think that you're just likely to think about like really deeply what you actually want to do in life outside from the influences of like your parents or like your school or your peers or whatever. I think that this just gives students a lot of time to actually develop themselves personally, actually like understand what they want to do in uni and what they then want to do in their job. I think that they're able to augment that with the experiences that they gain from taking a gap year. And then thirdly, I would just note that the types of things you're doing are probably just quite fulfilling to your character. So for example, through volunteering, you build things like empathy. Through going through travel, and you like when you see different people, you like develop yourself and you open your mind and your perspective, things like that. I would note this is particularly valuable because in the counterfactual, you're probably just pushed from high school to uni to a job to another job, and then suddenly you're like old and you can't do anything anymore. Like, excuse the perhaps crude like characterization, but I think that in the counterfactual, you just are unable to actually access these experiences, or you're unable to access them to the degree that you are now. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, I think that uni students just gain understandings and experiences and exposure to new things that are quite valuable. They develop as people, they gain empathy. And then secondly, I think that's particularly valuable and unique. And then secondly, I would know that in a practical sense, this is probably a prerequisite to properly choosing what you want to do in your life. You choose your uni degree better, you choose your job better, et cetera, et cetera. You get better life outcomes. For those reasons, so proud to government. Thank you.
Gap years are a privilege largely reserved for the wealthy, those whose families actually have the money to support a year of self-exploration. They are not suited for everyone, whether due to financial reasons or just the complete lack of structure that gap years often provide, which can lead to recklessness instead of growth. So proud to oppose them. So just a couple of points to crystallize this debate further. Firstly, I just want to clarify what kids between the ages of 18 to like 19 are like. I think that their prefrontal cortex has not fully developed, and neither has their amygdala. This means that their emotional regulation and maturity is not fully realized at this age, and this leads to more irrationality, impulsiveness, etc. And they have also just graduated high school, which is extremely structured. You have to attend class for a set amount of hours every day. You have to submit these assignments. So when these kids are entering their gap year, most of them are likely to abuse the freedom that the gap years offer because they are scared of it being taken away once entering university, leading to more impulsive and irrational behavior. Secondly, let me just clarify what these gap years look like. I think that they're just planned breaks that would take place in a post-secondary education, so right after high school. This could be to travel, to work, volunteer, or develop skills. So a couple of crucial things to note about gap years. Firstly, that they lack the structure that universities offer, especially for when you're traveling or exploring yourself in this gap year. I think universities, although are typically more relaxed than high school, still offer some sense of structure. It requires you to attend class daily, submit assignments, etc. And I think this allows students to like slowly transition to a life where they have more freedom, as opposed to gap years where they have full freedom thrown at them. They're more likely to abuse this freedom and show reckless or irresponsible behavior, which in the long term can affect their life adversely. I think these students still need structured learning because immediately giving them freedom would just cause like all of these net harms. Secondly, which is even more crucial, I think gap years are a privilege reserved for the rich. A lot of the time, gap years require a lot of financial resources, social capital, and a safety net that the families typically offer, and etc. Because you're essentially taking a pause from traditional or educational career paths, I think you essentially lose momentum and need your family or some type of support system to support you financially. I don't think that everyone has access to this type of abundant stash of money, and gap years are mainly just reserved for the rich. Finally, I think that gap years are just not suitable for every recently graduated high schooler. Sure, it will work for the few select outliers who are mature enough to plan this gap year out to actually be conducive to themselves or have this intrinsic motivation that will push them to strive for more that would come naturally due to the competitive environment of the university. But most of the time, throwing full freedom at people who are used to structured education leads to irresponsibility. Finally, we want to clarify that we are not wholly against the notion of having gap years for a few students, that we think it can work for them in the way that Prop may frame it. But the rise of gap years leading to the normalization or glorification of it encourages people to take it. But gap years are just not suitable for every single student. Our counterfactual has been clear-cut. As university bodies, we continuously improve and modernize the school curriculum. Experiential learning, such as internships and collaborations with major partners and companies, with a safety net that ensures all students compete in the same game where access is universal. Now, moving on to some direct responses, I think they told you that students will just be better off financially. Panels, I think this is just simply not true, and we can easily flip this claim. Firstly, that gap years are largely reserved for the rich. To be able to travel, volunteer, etc., you need a lot of money and a support system and a safety net. Not many people have this privilege, and even if it is to get this job, with the extremely competitive job market, I think it's going to be unlikely that they are hired unless their family has connections. And two, sure, let's take them at their best case scenario. You get a job, you know about employability and market conditions. I think the job market is just so competitive that there is no guarantee that a student right out of high school will be hired immediately, and that is crucial time that is lost. And secondly, I think that whatever job you're going to get, since you are lacking these qualifications, they're not generally conducive for future job prospects. And third, I think income, but I think by delaying university, you wait another year where the job market gets more and more competitive and are more geared to AI, needing less human capital. And whatever job opportunities you get during this gap year will not be conducive because they may be in a different industry or require different qualifications that you don't get until you graduate university. Now moving to my arguments, let me forward two arguments, firstly on disillusionment and second on the practical net harms.
Sure.
So for some context, I'll take that later. The premise of this argument is simple. Gap years are just not something everyone can afford. It is a privilege for individuals to partake in a gap year. They're structurally inaccessible to a large portion of students. And I think there's this growing narrative that is crucial for self-exploration and the prerequisite for attaining a better quality of life, deeming that it is essential for finding yourself and to enter post-secondary education with a clearer mind. Finally, I think fundamental contradictions as taking gap year exist because as taking gap year, it is not only an exclusive behavior that only the rich can endeavor, but it is simultaneously promoted as developmentally necessary. For some analysis, I think firstly it forms deep disillusionment among students who cannot take gap years because they are systematically excluded to do so. I think the self-discovery can also be found in university. Under Prop, these students internalize the message that self-discovery happens only on the outside of institutions, and those who enter directly inherently become more vulnerable. As a result of this disillusionment, it manifests in three aspects. Firstly, personal. Students may just start doubting themselves even when they're academically qualified, and the likelihood of this is that note that oftentimes these individuals are at a developmental stage, meaning that the idea of irrationality is not a far cry from what these people might do. Institutional then, I think when society starts to normalize gap years, universities are subjectively defined as places that you attend after growth, not spaces where growth meaningfully occurs. And on a structural level, I think the rise of gap years and the eventual normalization allows institutions to shift responsibility for exploration onto the individuals themselves, where universities oftentimes offer explorative curriculums. Sorry, I just realized that POI was during protected time, I believe. Now, moving on to my second argument on how gap years actually can cause net harms. I think the premise here is very simple. Gap years cause more harm than good. Context then, universities are unique because they offer a new environment to grow, learn, and push yourself. You are met with people who are on your same caliber or on a different level, and this pushes kids to become more competitive, motivating them to be more diligent and work harder to achieve their goals or stand out. And of course, you receive these formal qualifications and skills for whatever career you want to follow. Some analysis then on firstly on job prospects. I think in gap year, students have the opportunity to get jobs, but they are not going to be on the same caliber of jobs of people get after university, as they're unlikely to have degrees and qualifications. Note the extremely competitive job market that makes it less likely to make this contributive to their portfolio. And for all these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
The choices we make about what we want to do with our lives, who we want to be, are perhaps the most irreversible yet important in our lives. It is absurd that we pressure 18-year-old kids who barely know the world and the workforce, let alone themselves, to chain themselves to a track that they will inevitably regret. It is uniquely gap years that allow kids to see the light. Side with affirmative. Because if opposition wanted to characterize high schoolers as so reckless, as so knowledgeable, well, they needed to take a gap year so that they picked a good university degree. Because if their characterization was kids were incredibly risky, well, what was not going to stop them from just studying something like gender studies in university? If kids didn't know themselves in the way that they suggested, they needed gap years. Couple of questions. First of all, on the issue of financial stuff and poor students. Second of all, on growth. And third of all, on tourism. First of all, though, I want to make a couple of notes of setup. The first is why kids generally are pressured to go to uni. And the implication of this framing then is that students don't just wash around in gap years when they don't know what they're going to do, because the default path is university. So in the cases where they wanted to characterize students will just be going around, not really controlling their time very well, in those instances they are pressured to go into university. What are the reasons why? First, because it's an incentive to target high school students so that they go to university. If you're in high school, oftentimes you get things where the university students will come to the high school and say, you got to come to university. Or it's like your teachers saying, you need to score highly so that you can go into university. The high school environment pressures kids into higher education, which means that their default pathway is going into university. But second, capitalism dismisses breaks. That is to say, capitalism values work over all else. It's the reason why people often will deride you. They'll say, you're wasting your time going and traveling rather than getting a degree and going into the workforce. It's parents that say, you need to be getting a degree as soon as possible so that you can get the most amount of income. The conclusion of that analysis then is the instances where kids go to university, go and take gap years, is when A, they really don't know themselves, B, they need money to get into university, which also shows that the debate predominantly happens in instances that are beneficial to us. Therefore, we think that this is incredibly important. The next question then is on the issue of financial stuff and poor individuals. The first thing I'm going to do is respond to their argument about, well, the job market is very tight, you probably won't be able to get a job due to artificial intelligence. Obviously not true. You can probably work at a cafe, you can probably work at McDonald's, you can probably get an internship. The structural reason why is it is just true in the status quo that there are an enormous amount of jobs. So maybe you can't work at a bank, but you probably can work in a cafe or something similar, which we would note is enormously important because it means kids can get money before they can go to university, so they can actually pay for it, so they can have the security to pursue university education in the first place. But additionally, it's important so that they can get experience and growth before they make the decision, before they go on that pathway. The next thing that their push on poor students then is that, well, poor kids will feel really bad because all the rich kids take gap years and that makes them feel upset. Firstly, I would note it is only a minority of rich students that go on gap years, so it is, as per my framing, so it is unclear why this is a particularly important harm. But second, people feeling upset is something that they can get over. They can rationalize it to themselves. They can say, well, I'm pursuing university already. That's probably something. I'm actually gaining an advantage over those people. It is unclear that they will internalize this in the bad way that they suggest. But lastly, I would note this argument is incredibly marginal. Sure, they might feel a bit upset, but that's clearly less important than all the material we brought to you at MIA. Firstly, we told you that kids that otherwise couldn't afford university got the ability to pay for it, right? Not everywhere offers proper student loan programs, even in the instances where they do offer student loan programs, oftentimes it is not feasible because students might have low credit scores because of the fact that they might not be willing to take on this much debt. The ability for kids to just work and get money to go to university is significantly more important and is a far bigger issue of inequality than what they point to. But second, we told you they were better able to get a job out of university. The reason why is because university is often very intense. You don't have a lot of time to do work. And so it is good that you have had that experience working in the past so that when you leave university, you can get a job in the first instance and start earning more money. But third, we told you it meant that students were more likely to pick good degrees. Because if you go into the workforce, you know that you have to study something useful. You have experience of scrolling through websites and saying, oh crap, I need an engineering degree to succeed in the workforce. And that experience means they're more likely to study something valuable. They're more likely to pursue internships in university, which ultimately increases their ability to get a job out of university. So we flip their argument on poor students in all of those ways. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Okay, so wouldn't the job opportunities universities offer through holistic or experiential curriculum programs be more conducive to their future portfolios and job prospects than
No,
working?
Sorry. You can't, right? Because you're too busy doing university, and so you can't access that. But additionally, when you're doing that, you've already picked your job. So you don't know. You presume that students are going to university in the first place. But our argument is that to go to university, to be able to afford it, you need to be working prior to that. So that response doesn't work. The next question then is on growth. And their main claim is that, well, the universities will encourage you to have growth anyway. The problem is that people often don't experience the growth. The mechanisms we told you at MIA were firstly, that people had a lot of time to think about what they wanted to do with their life. In university, you're constantly stressing about the next assignment that you have to do. You've already set yourself on a path, and so you haven't fully considered what you actually want to do. You're too busy to think about growth. Even if the university offers some internship program, you don't rationalize it to yourself and think through what you want to do enough, which means you don't access those same kinds of benefits. But second, we point you that these kinds of university programs aren't actually that good for growth. Like going into a university experience internship or whatever probably isn't as valuable as going and seeing the world, exposing yourself to different cultures, to different ways of life, trying out different volunteering experiences, going and trying out different internships before you go into university is ultimately a bigger opportunity for growth because you expose yourself to more experiences. But lastly, I would argue that universities often don't prioritize these experiences for growth. The structural reason why is that the university has an incentive to focus on academics because academics are what attracts people to universities insofar as academics are the things that universities offer, but also because the people that run the university, i.e. professors, care the most about academics, and therefore they're likely to prioritize academics over the other things, which is why universities often don't do this in the same way. Their main response here is that you need to transition to freedom in the beneficial way. The problem here is university isn't actually that structured in the first place, right? You have to pick your own classes, you have to go to class, it doesn't enforce you, and so it is good that so their premise of this argument is that, well, the university is very rigorous. It's not, it's also very unstructured. But even if that's not true, we think that getting experience in having a lot of freedom is really good because it teaches you how to manage your time. It teaches you how to be a successful person. And I would note that it's very unlikely that this looks like kids lazing around with their family because either you're working, which is structured, or you're reliant on your family's income and your family has an incentive to pressure you into using your time valuable because they don't want you to just be lazing around in their basement. They want you to be going out and getting jobs and getting internships and volunteering so that they eventually leave the basement and enjoy something positive. So either you're working, which is structured, or you're reliant on your family's income and your family will pressure you into not wasting your time. For all of these reasons, proud to propose.
Imagine handling a 17-year-old the keys to an unrestricted life where they can travel, they can get jobs, and total freedom before their brain has fully matured. Gap years promise growth, but actually often deliver chaos and poor decision making. This is the world Proposition advocates for. So proud to propose. On the top of my speech, then, I have a few clarifications, Judge. Firstly, I think that Proposition needs to realize that the notion of gap years is actually a very Western notion, right? This is something that is not actually inherently seen in Asian cultures because, yes, university and pursuing higher academics becomes the notion in a lot of Asian countries, meaning that they have a burden to pursue. Why this is inherently necessary for kids who are living in environments with high academic pressure and these Asian cultures to actually combat what their parents want them to do, right? Why this is actually so inherently important then. Secondly, we don't have a burden to prove to you why gap years are all bad, but simply why the narrative itself shouldn't be spotlighted, right? So we oppose the rise in this motion, which leads me to my first clash then panels when they talk about the financial benefits here. I think this has been a back and forth from both speakers, right? They tell you that gap years actually all of these people an opportunity to work, and how this is actually extremely crucial for the vulnerable and the lower class students who actually need to be financially independent and find money to even go to university, right? I have a few points under this. Note that not a lot of people can get the many benefits you get from gap years, right? We tell you that gap years inherently cost much, especially when you're living off your parents. When you want to actually pursue something such as a higher education, sure, it requires a lot of money, but at the end of the day, there are opt-out mechanisms such as scholarships that you can actually get. The benefits here are not inherent that they propose to you. They're based on externalities, right? When you get an internship and like fancy jobs in these firms, they're often exclusive to those who have family connections that could even lend them these jobs. But in their very best case, right, where they say, oh, you can literally just work in a cafe or McDonald's, you become a barista or waitress, which don't necessarily require the qualifications. They tell you, even if it's just working at McDonald's for $10 an hour, it's still better for some students. But telling them that a job in McDonald's is what they need as a prerequisite to success is inherently harmful, Judge, because you're
You are.
shaping them to be long-term earners that don't even earn much, right? And you're in fact hindering their potential and capacity to get further ahead in life and preparing them for better careers. We tell you that this is the only they tell you that this is the only option, when in reality there are other things such as scholarships, free courses, etc., that actually helps them improve their skills. On our side though, we have a better mechanism for this. Going to good university, even if it's just a state college or community college or through scholarships, actually sets you up a better job in the future. They can still work part-time, Judge, and make money in the side. I think this is a real experience they need to actually gain skills in time and stress management and having to deal with their schedules and also all the assignments that they have in university. We don't think that they're inherently too busy to work in university, because in fact, university is literally structured for flexible scheduling because freedom is gradually given to the students, right? This is an example in Australia, for example, where international students of subclass 500 visas can literally work up to 48 hours per fortnight during semesters and unlimited during breaks. So the system literally provides them a framework to actually take part-time jobs, right? So the benefit is not exclusive to proposition. But before I move on, yes, I'll take the POI.
Given the pressure to actually go to university and Oscar's material on why university is the default, do you not agree that students who then choose to defy that and then choose to take a gap year to work actually have a incredibly strong reason and an incredibly strong necessity for that money?
Okay. So even if they have a strong incentive, strong motivation, strong groundwork as to why they want to go for a gap year, we think that this is inherently flawed, which we will expand later on in my extension, right? Second clash then on growth. They tell you that the live experience is something important for self-development. It's irreversible. These people need to experience freedom. It teaches you time management and how to succeed, right? Because there's inherent pressure from your family, so you won't be lazy or you're actually financially working for yourself. But panels, note that these lived experience, they actually do sound noble under proposition, but the unstructured gap year, the freedom here often actually teaches you poor time management, not mastery here. We want to tell you that teens often waste time scrolling or drifting without deadlines, right? And this doesn't actually set them up for success, Judge, especially because there's no guarantee mechanism that actually forces them to actually do work and be productive, right? Which leads me to my extension then on why this culture and its trickle-down effects inherently harmful. Note that these people, after post-secondary school, these are teenagers entering adulthood. Note that this is a pivotal phase of growth, Judge. These are the individuals that crave experiences, they have curiosity, and they're going through different stages of exploration, right? Note that with the dominant notion on social media on these gap years, you see glorifications of people traveling. They're figuring out their lives and their newfound freedom, and they tell you that this is exactly what you need. A few points then on why this is extremely harmful. Number one, note that these teenagers are likely to be at the age of 18 and 19. They're not fully adults, but treated as one. This is where you give them the freedom to do all things without a structured framework for learning, a curriculum. There's an inherent shock for these individuals, especially when they have lived in an academic environment their entire lives, right? You're essentially throwing them into real world with no guarantee guaranteed of learning. This is especially crucial, Judge, and counters proposition's repetitive claim that lived experience is most important, because both sides need to agree with the fact that everyone learns differently. This means that what works for one person does not mean it will work for the other. Sure, in the best case, some individuals will think that taking a gap year is the best decision of their lives and how it has provided them with so many opportunities for growth, etc. But note that not everyone has the privilege and capacity to maximize their learning during the gap year here. Some may lack the resources, connections, and some don't even have the discipline to stay productive. Ultimately, the benefit rely on so many externalities and are literally uncertain. But third, it also leads to insecurity, Judge, because when your gap years don't look like the girl on Instagram that's traveled the whole world, it gives room to breed resentment, comparison, and self-doubt. We don't think that this is something they need in their growth stage, right? But why does our side actually advocate for a better framework for these individuals? We tell you the importance of mentorship and structured learning is something they need for their growth, right? Because these are the individuals who don't have the prefrontal cortex fully developed for maturity and the experiences that help them face issues. This means that they're given freedom by someone in their 30s and 40s, but without their capacity. Only on our side then, with the mentors, professors, lecturers, and all of the adults actually helping you and supporting you in growth, can they actually grow to their full potential. For all those reasons, then, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
In 3, 2, 1. Opposition repeats a line throughout their entire case, and it is simply that not everyone is able to get a reasonable benefit from the gap year. Okay, fair enough. But similarly, not everyone is also able to get a reasonable benefit from going into university straight away, right? Maybe these are the same kids who are under a bunch of pressure who necessarily want to escape that pressure for a brief period of time, and going into university immediately would be the worst possible thing for them. My point is, it is unclear as to whether or not going into a gap year is a good experience for you. Sure. Also unclear as to whether going immediately into university is a good experience for you. The difference then is that we fight the norm and we support the counteracting norm of the one that says that you need to go into university straight away, of the one that says spending time to travel and to spend time with your friends and to do your hobbies and to gain financial means is the waste of time because you ought to be pursuing your education. The unique benefit there is that we give kids the ability to choose and to decide, because your life didn't end if your gap year did not look like the one on the girl's Instagram post, but you were able to learn and grow from that experience in a way that wouldn't have even been accessible to you if you bought into the narrative that university was something that you had to do immediately after high school, and therefore stopped yourself from gaining these experiences. Two themes then in the speech, firstly on growth and secondly on finances. Firstly on growth, before I dive into this theme, I'd like to make a clarification. A large amount of opposition's case relies on the fact that teens are just a little bit silly, and they clarify the majority of stakeholders within this debate as being about 18 to 19 years old. I would encourage them to read the info slide again, because it says that this gap year can be taken post-secondary years, so immediately after or during post-secondary years. What that means is that you're not necessarily always dealing with teens, but you're also dealing with a broad range of adults who might be doing it, between their university years before they have to take a job. And therefore their benefits are immediately minimized by them because they have altered it to just basically only apply as they specify to 17, 18, 19-year-olds. But moving on to the more important stuff in the theme. Firstly, I'll talk about teens and their behaviors, which is taking opposition's case at their best. Opposition tells you that teens can be immature and develop bad habits. Two responses. Firstly, I think this is you going out and going through a lived experience is by far unique to teens and into their experiences in comparison to institutions. So this looks like, for instance, you could learn the meaning of time management if you go onto class late, which might be something that's really bad if you arrive 20 minutes late. No further consequences. I think you're able to gain far better lessons when you learn these experiences. For example, when you're traveling and you miss a flight because of your silly time management skills, and that was something that was going to have far more impact on you, something that probably mattered to you a lot more because of how generally irreversible it was. It's pretty hard to just rebook a flight, for instance, and that meant that you were able to uniquely earn better life lessons because there was a larger scale impact, and because it probably mattered to you more personally. For instance, maybe you don't care about missing 20 minutes of a particular class. Maybe it damaged you a lot and it hurt you a lot that you missed the flight to a holiday you were excited to go on, or to a country you were excited to travel to. So that explains why the impacts are likely to increase for teens in terms of this because they were likely to take it far more seriously. But secondly, I just think that it's likely that you have guardians who are watching you anyway and making sure that, all is well. And I think the intuitive mechanism for this is that parents probably know if their kids are going on a gap year, and parents probably care about the kids because they are their parents and they spent like 18 years, like 19 years raising them. So you're likely to have guardians who, in the worst case, manage things for you, like work out a schedule, like tell you, like wake you up in the morning. And that means that you still live with some sort of structure, but you still get the benefits of all of like the live experience as we explained to you previously. But also I just think that it means that they're likely to keep you safe in either way. So they're likely to call up on you if you're in a foreign country, like Czech, blah, blah, blah. Okay, secondly, they tell you that secondly, on institutions, then they tell you that universities might deviate from growth opportunities. Firstly, we explained to you from Oscar as to why they're unlikely to have as good opportunities. So they have direct incentives, for example, by professors to achieve academic results instead of providing opportunities. But secondly, I would note that, like in their best case, in which they do have opportunities, they're probably universities of large prestige that firstly flips their stuff about the wealth like gap because only the wealthy people can get into these areas. But secondly, probably have direct incentives to have those opportunities anyway, because another incentive of universities was to care about their prestige and to care about their image, and it was probably good for them to have those opportunities. And yeah, I'll take your POI.
Note that the guidance on your side is not sustainable. You can't have your parents tail on you forever. Only in university can you actually build responsibility incrementally.
Yep, sure. Like I think no, as I explained to you previously, there are unique ways of building growth and of building responsibility that from lived experiences in comparison to university. So that looks like, for instance, as I explained to you, things mattering to you a lot more and things on like, your what's it called, like your gap year, because if that was the point at which you enjoyed your holiday instead of just going to an educational institution. But secondly, as my second already talked about, like institutions and universities aren't necessarily always going to be structured as well. Professors don't have because professors, they don't hire professors to teach in most universities, but for research. So professors don't always have the ability to just look after you and to make sure that everything is going fine for you. What we mean by the end of this, at the end of this theme, note that lived experiences were crucial and extremely important. And even if it was true that gaining experience and gaining, responsibility from either side was symmetric, once you went into the workforce and once you went into university with the same narrative that doing such things would just be wasting time, you probably couldn't ever afford to do these things ever again because of capitalistic pressures. That was the point at which you probably ought to buy into a gap year, even if, the responsibility and stuff was symmetric. Okay, secondly then, and briefly on financials, I would recharacterize gap years because opposition tells you that it's only accessible to the rich, but we explain, and the info slide, that it is not, that it is just an extended break. So there is no requirement of what you definitionally have to do. So you don't have to go on holiday. But even assuming this on the wealth gap, they tell you that poorer kids are likely to be isolated. Note that this is going to be symmetric. So the wealth gap will probably always exist. The difference then is that there were previously existing norms against gap years because of things like capitalism. So the difference was that we gave them the social freedom and the ability to work and the ability to provide for themselves. Then opposition tells you that it's going to be really difficult to have a job and that there are alternatives. Note that alternatives are often very difficult, such as, for example, scholarships, very difficult to get, not able to be handed out to everyone. But secondly, largely things like taking courses are symmetric, and we would argue that it is better done under our side when they have more free time to dedicate to those courses. And for those reasons, very proud to govern.
2, 1. Panels, not every trip to Thailand or every so-called community building experience or whatever you may partake in a gap year results in this kind of revelation or this kind of spiritual awakening at the very end of the day. But yet, proposition has told you continuously that this loosely structured experiences that one would gain from partaking in a gap year and these short-term work acts as the strongest substitutes for real development that one would actually find in these kinds of university. So even if at the very end of the day their case works and they win this whole entire debate, they eventually influence how societies perceive gap years, especially in Eastern societies, and distort the very notion and idea of merit that many educational institutions pride on. And it's for this reason I'm extremely proud to oppose. So before moving on to my first clash on feasibility and outcomes when one would take in a gap year, some clarifications and strategic mistakes to finally pave the way for this debate. So three things. Firstly, why does university provide a much better and qualitative and quantitative experience rather than taking a gap year? Three things. Firstly, university's main goal is to build knowledge over time, meaning that it makes these individuals expertise in their own major and their own accord. Now, this factor is extremely crucial because in today's economy, one would actually have to differentiate themselves from the rise of AI and the idea that human capital is oftentimes being threatened by these pervasive tensions. So we tell you that under our side of the house, universities still give room for these students to explore themselves through ECAs, clubs, and oftentimes select certain courses to customize their own learning journey. We've already made this extremely clear. But also secondly, my second speaker also recharacterized the financial clash. Universities are structured for flexible learning and within boundaries. And this is the one thing that we provide. Given the fact that most of these students who are taking these gap years are oftentimes 18 or 19 years old, they're oftentimes most likely irrational given the keys to this kind of very unruly decision that they have to make at the very end of the day. So we tell you that taking a gap year for lower class individuals is not the only option. They can still simply go to community college and transfer into a much better high ranking college at the very end of the day. But also thirdly, they haven't responded to their worst case, where these individuals do end up in chaos and having to deal with their poor consequences or their poor actions. We tell you that under our side of the house, we mitigate that risk because we provide a safety net that is unparalleled when you see contrary to what proposition has told you. But done with my clarifications, now moving on to the strategic mistakes that have costed proposition this debate. Two things. Firstly, they have not elaborated their case further. They just mischaracterized the whole idea as university providing this whole workload of stress and a bunch of homework that a lot of these students have to deal with. We tell you that now with the current modern day and age, oftentimes these universities already provide a lot of holistic measures to mitigate this. But also secondly, we never said that we don't think certain students need to work before universities. Again, this motion is about the rise of gap years, not whether or not we support or oppose. With that being said, we think the rise in gap year just glorifies them and frames them as growth experience, which oftentimes raises the benchmarks for these students who oftentimes don't have access to these kind of opportunities. For example, a higher class student may have access to these necessary jobs as a whole. So done with my strategic mistakes and clarifications, now I'll be taking that POI.
Yeah, your case puts the cart before the horse. Even if these students have opportunities to grow in university, the problem is it's too late because they've already locked themselves into one career path.
But oftentimes universities still provide certain courses to actually customize their learning journey. In America, you can actually declare oneself as undecided. There's still several different mechanisms that universities provide to ensure that these students, when they're still uncertain about their decision, can still change at the very end of the day. We still provide space. So done with my strategic mistakes. Now moving on to my first clash on what proposition has told you. Firstly, they told you that gap years provide time and space for students to improve their financial situation, such as partaking a job. Now, they told you this, but we tell you that this is simply untrue due to three factors. Firstly, most gap year employment available to students are simply low wages or unstable. This looks like fast food jobs or part-time jobs that simply cannot satiate large costs such as student loans. But also secondly, the quote-unquote exposure to the market at this stage is not strategic exposure at the very end of the day. Students do not choose roles that build transferable skills. They simply choose the roles that will actually satiate this whole money burden that oftentimes these universities possess at the very end of the day. But also thirdly, the mechanism that prop relies on to propel their case is structurally weak at the very end of the day because of this very factor. Capitalism does not reward rest, right? It rewards the whole notion of efficiency. So we tell you that this does not actually alleviate their whole entire situation. But let's further bolster this sentiment. We tell you that labor markets often oftentimes reward seniority or the idea of credentials. You need to be this kind of Stanford graduate to enter a well-paying job. So we tell you that not young and bright minds under the capitalist system that prop hinges on would actually pose a strong competition against these workers who have worked in this kind of like corporate ladder for like 15 years. So as a result, early workers are already put into positions with minimal skills required or with just these low paying jobs as a whole, where under our side, we provide faster access to institutional financial aid and internships. So under side proposition, they're just simply delaying that entry there and therefore delaying that access for these students to actually re-enter the university and actually find a well-paying job. But let's be charitable and engage with our best case and why it's not enough at the very end of the day. So for example, a student secures a stable form of work and saves enough money to pay for their own university. At the very end of the day, this is not enough because you risk the barriers you will face once you re-enter university, and you're simply dealing with a job that is extremely rare in today's economy, especially when you're juggling between two aspects of life. So even in our worst case, where students are stressed out and become financially locked into these short-term outcomes, the harm is temporary. Universities still provide connections and grants that will help alleviate these financial costs. So let us just do the final weighing once and for all. What has side opposition provided that has like gained them like a momentum in this debate? Firstly, we ensure that every single student still has space to self-explore through grants, customization of their learning, and overall like research and participation that like helps make them become competitive like individuals within the job market. But also secondly, we believe that gap years that are simply loosely structured do not provide any form of holistic measures because of the risk that they posit at the very end of the day. We mitigate that risk. We provide a safety net for all students, which is why I'm extremely proud to oppose. Thank you, Judge.
I think Prop's biggest mistake is embellishing the impact one single year can have on somebody's lives. I think that in the 4+ years students use to start building their portfolios for their university applications is actually enough time for what they want, for what they want to do. Even then, universities allow you to declare yourself as undecided, to switch your major or take double majors. And even that is our worst case scenario because universities just offer more safety nets than taking gap years. So proud to oppose them. Firstly, a couple of strategic mistakes. I think firstly, Prop assumes that people just don't have access to gap years without its rise in normalization. I think the amount of research going into university actually takes, so writing essays, finding which universities generally align with you, etc., also leads you to other avenues that may align with your values and your needs more. Prop insists that these students are just not silly or are responsible enough to go through these gap years responsibly. But finding other avenues other than university is just simply too unrealistic for them, which I just think is not suited to actual realistic conditions then. Secondly, Prop also tells you that gap years are discouraged because capitalism rejects breaks. I think this is true and we can easily concede to this, but that doesn't change the fact that the capitalistic system is what we all live in, and this system structurally disadvantages and punishes those that takes gap years for travel, self-discovery, etc., proving our point of causing net harms under their own metric and characterization. Now, moving on to the clashes firstly on financial prospects and second on self-discovery. I think for our case, we posited that gap years in and of itself are reserved for the rich, and if taken by the poor due to this normalization or glorification, causes you to be more financially indebted. Now, so, for example, connections are needed to get more desirable jobs in the gap year, and money is needed to support traveling or whatever endeavors people pursue. Secondly, whatever job done by these students during the gap year are just not conducive for their future prospects. Their responses were that they told you that it's not reserved for the rich only, but it takes a level of privilege for you. But even then, it takes you a level of privilege for you to go through things like self-exploration and travel. Secondly, even if Prop tells you that their families give them pressure to be productive, their work ethic solely relies on intrinsic motivation or whatever competition surrounds them. So when they're in an environment where there is no competition pushing on them and don't have that inherent motivation, which we say is inconsistent with this age group, on our side, you actually you lack that external motivation to keep moving forward. Now, thirdly, I think sure that working in McDonald's can give you experience, but it entraps people in cycles of financials. We tell you that even if it's just going to community college, having a degree still gives you more career prospects. They told you, but however, their cases consist of allowing low-income students to get jobs and pay for their university studies, and secondly, input exposure to future market conditions to help their future. I don't think this is enough because yes, sure, students can get jobs in cafes, McDonald's, but these are generally low-paying jobs that are unlikely to help for their full tuition. Even then, I think a lot of universities just offer financial aid programs like Harvard, with people who make less than $100,000 a year can get in for free. And a lot of universities in different countries actually offer education for free. And secondly, I just think all in all, proposition just ignores realistic circumstances, because whatever job you get in your growth year as a gap year, as a barista, etc., requires skills that are not transferable to these more desirable, high-paying jobs. I think we win this clash because we're generally just more realistic, because we take into account these factors of the job market. And I think we just generally take into account that the traditional method of immediately entering university is what society rewards and is what the job market is geared to. And and for all these reasons, I'm so proud to listen to you.
General observations about the debate, second on finance, and third on growth. First, two observations about the debate. First, we would know that kids are already pressured into going to university. We told you that was because high schools pressure kids into going to university. It looks like university students coming and talking to kids about what major they want to do. We also told you that capitalism pushes them into university as they concede up and down the bench. Therefore, the default is going to university. This is enormously important in the round because it showed you that in cases where kids didn't know what they wanted to do, they were probably going to go to university anyway. The reason then when kids chose to go on gap years was because they made a deliberate decision to do so. Additionally, it showed you the cases where kids took gap years was when they simply couldn't afford to go to university because it was the default option. So obviously there are cases where gap years are good. Obviously there are cases where gap years are bad. We told you predominantly they chose cases where gap years were good because of the fact that there was this pressure to go to university. First clash then on finance. Let's go through what their responses to our claims. Their first was that, well, there are alternative measures like scholarships and free courses, but we would know that in the cases where those exist, students are likely to go to university anyway. But secondly, they told us that, well, you can probably work through university, but this put the cart before the horse because you had to get and pay for university in the first place before you could go and pay for it. Obviously there are some cases where you can put a college debt down. That is not true in all of the different cases. They tell us you can go to community college, but you still have to pay for community college. And so for very poor people, this is still an important thing for people to do. But even in their best case, we told you that even if you couldn't pay for university, it was important that you just had a bit of money on the side so that when you went into university, you could focus on your studies, but you could not stress all the time because you had a little bit of money to support you during university. Their claim here was that, well, poor kids will feel sad. The problem is poor kids will feel more sad if they can't go to university at all. Weigh this on vulnerability. Kids going to university is just the most important impact in this debate. Even if some rich kids waste 1 year, that is less important than people being able to pay for university in the first instance. Even if that's not true, then let's move on to the second clash about growth and why we win that. Their claim here is mostly that kids will tend to waste time. We gave you a number of responses. First, we told you that not these kids would make this decision because the default was to go to university. So the kids that were kind of lazing around would just choose to go to university in the first place. But second, look at their response. They say, well, you can just do an undecided major. Doesn't sound very productive to me. If the problem is that kids aren't very motivated and they take an undecided major, they will probably also scroll on TikTok all day. It is unclear what the delta is. Additionally, we told you this was a very patronizing characterization. We think that when they made the decision to go on to gap years, they probably were going to do it in a positive way. Additionally, we told you that parents were going to pressure you because either you were working, which was structured, or you were reliant on your parents' income, in which case your parents would pressure you into being productive, into not wasting your time. Their response is, well, this teaches dependence on your parents. The problem is they teach dependence to a greater extent because they're relying on institutions. And additionally, you're reliant on your parents on their side of the house as well. So it's unclear where there was delta there. Additionally, this characterization of teenagers is unrealistic. Teenagers are probably incredibly stressed about the workforce. They're probably going to be doing things like volunteering and thinking about what they want to do. Their second claim here is that university provides structures for growth. The problem here was that the growth happens after the fact because it was about what degree you chose, what sort of life decision that you made. You needed the experience, you needed the time to reflect in order to make this decision. They say you can pick an undecided degree, but I think that incurs all of the harms of that they suggest, while also incurring more harms of having to pay for an undecided degree. And they actually say, they concede that kids need internal motivation to grow. And this is exactly Serena's mechanism, because it's only when you're on a gap year that you grow from the benefits of university. So even if the university tells you to to do good stuff, because it's not your decision, you aren't benefiting from it in the same way. We told you this was a unique ability for you to get experience because you needed a lot of time to reflect. But in university, you were so busy with things like assignments that you didn't have the time to reflect on this. But additionally, university locked you onto one path. It was uniquely gap years that allowed you to try a whole bunch of industries, to go to a variety of different countries, to work in a variety of different fields. And it was uniquely that breadth of experience that provided you with growth. They put the cart before the horse. Maybe you could grow in university. Maybe you could make money in university, but you needed to be able to know what you wanted to do in university and to pay for university before any of that.